to have you back on another awesome episode of Building a Better South Africa Together, brought to you by Anglo American and why. Now, one of the major issues in the country, outside of corruption, outside of the high unemployment rates, is civic participation, right? We are celebrating 30 years of our very, very young democracy, which is a huge milestone. But the question is, what can we do to kind of aid the urgency around civic participation? And joining us to help us out with this conversation is Lindiwe Mazibuko from Futurelect. We also do have Mbali Ntuli from Groundwork Collective. Hello, ladies.
Hi.
Welcome to the show.
Thank you.
So happy to have you here. Lindiwe, I'm going to start with you. 2024 elections are only a couple of months away. And of course, there's a lot of anticipation. There's a lot of expectation around the elections. Is there still a lot that needs to be done in order to get South Africans to participate in this huge, huge moment in the country?
Yeah, the short answer is yes. There is a huge amount of work to be done. We've just received the results of a census that tells us there are 41 million eligible voters in this country. But we know that in 2021, only 12 million of them showed up for the elections. So the gap is massive, and most of the gap is made up by young people. But the problem with the discussion that we tend to have around voter participation is we always have it 5 minutes before election day.
Yes, yeah.
We don't keep it going in between elections, and we don't talk enough about what voters and citizens can do to participate in the democratic process between elections. So for us, yes, the work is urgent, but it's always urgent, both before elections and afterwards.
Absolutely. Mbali, I'm going to switch to you now. I mean, there are a lot of young people who participate in elections. There's a lot of young people who are still a little bit uncertain about what this would mean. A lot of young people still don't know and understand the importance of voting and how important it is to have your voice heard, right? There will be a few drives to get new voters in, but why not just focus on the people who have already registered to vote and kind of place the importance on them?
I think it's important because what you want to actually do is make sure that you're not leaving young people out of the conversation and the formal democratic process, because you want them to be continuing to be lifelong voters and to take part in their democracy. But also importantly, of the existing voters, it actually shows that the ages between 42 to 59 are the ones that are most disillusioned, because they were actually coming into their adulthood when our democracy started, and they haven't quite felt that the democracy has yielded all of the results that they wanted to. And we have this huge demographic of young people, and nobody's taken the time to really engage them to the amount that they should be. And so we're leaving an entire demographic behind. And that's why this election is important. But it's also a time for us, I think, to reset as a country and to get back into civics and to make sure that this is the cornerstone of what we actually do to make sure that our citizens are active, and particularly with young people who have no historical allegiances, who are still malleable in terms of being able to learn and absorb things, and who haven't been disillusioned completely out of actually taking part. So I think that it presents us with a great opportunity to really reset the country and take our focus onto being a more active country, as Lindiwe says, in between elections and not just when it's election time.
Absolutely. Lindiwe, I'm going to go back to you on this one. Do you feel that young people feel apathy towards the leaders in the country, and what do you think we can do to combat this?
No, I don't think that they feel apathetic about politics. They might feel apathetic about the way some leaders conduct themselves in the political system. But there's a march in this country every day of the year. There isn't a single day of the year that goes by in this country without a march taking place somewhere.
Yeah.
And that's one of the ways that young people have been demonstrated by other generations is the most effective way to get their voices heard. So we know that we have a youth and a general population that are hungry to be heard, but because we don't have civic education as part of our curriculum at school, because it's not even part of the university curriculum, they turn 18 and they don't actually know what power they have to influence the way things happen outside from protesting. And the key here is, one of the things young people learn, and people often complain about this, is that the more violent the protest is, the more effective it'll be. So they burn things and they destroy property. That's actually a rational choice, because when you ramp that level of chaos up, that's when leaders start listening. So it's clear to me from that young people are agitated, they have views, they have opinions about how the government should be running this country, and they want to be part of those decision-making structures, but they've just never been given a legitimate avenue to do so. And that's again why this isn't an event. This has to be lifelong work, and it has to start as soon as you're old enough to register, which by the way in this country is 16, not 18.
Oh wow. See? You learn something new every day. Here we go. you mention, Lindiwe mentions civic education, right? And Mbali, you're quite passionate about civic education as well. Can you explain to us why you're so passionate about it?
I think for me, why I'm really passionate about civic education is because it's the one way that once you teach people how they can be empowered, how they can make sure that they can have decision making, whether it's about the burst water pipe outside, whether it's about sitting on an SGB that deals with education policy for their kids, or about the crime and policing in their area, then people mobilize on their own. And that's what you want to have in a mature democracy, as citizens being able to not have to wait for political parties, but to be able to know practically what they can do. And we have one of the most participatory democracies in the world. And so these things are all already in our legislation, they're in our constitution. And for me, I'm passionate about making sure that they understand how it is that they can access these avenues and really get a chance to be able to change their situations. Because otherwise what happens is we become a paralyzed nation of people who are patriotic and want to do the right thing, but don't know what to do. And so what we end up doing is complaining and then not voting. And then we have this cycle where you then have an unrepresentative democracy and unrepresentative government where you only have 12 million people coming out. And we can easily change that, but we're not going to change it if we don't do the hard work of getting civic education out everywhere, as Lindiwe says, in message, over time, all the time.
Yeah. Lindiwe, do we need a TikTok dance challenge to get people to understand the importance of civic education? Is that one of the ways that we need to kind of get the message out there that civic education is very, very important? What do you have to say about the digital space, new media, in that regard?
The short answer is yes.
Yeah.
We can't afford to be advertising on television or radio when none of our audience members are there. And we cannot afford to ignore the importance of digital platforms as a way of reaching, especially young people. And the point Mbali made is very important. People turn 18 or 16 every day in this country.
Yes.
So every time someone turns 18, they need to have access to that information in a language and on a medium that makes sense to them. And so we have to meet people where they are and not turn our nose up at new media as a way to engage people about civic education. So that's one of the things we've done at Futurelect. We've built a civic education learning platform. It's at learn.futurelect.org. And what you can do there is access a series of very short bite-sized video courses that teach you about the different systems in our democracy, and that will also teach you about how the electoral process works. Later, we're going to do a series of courses about how you can participate in between elections. And all of those three things come together: knowing about your democracy, knowing about how voting happens, and knowing about what to do after you're done voting to make sure you can help build the country that you want. Those, I think, are the three most important pillars of active citizenship. It's not just about turning up at the poll. And I think, again, there's going to be a heavy emphasis ahead of the election, certainly from political parties, because that's all their focus is on. They need votes, but we want people to be active citizens in between the vote, at by-elections. Lots of things happen politically in a country in between elections.
I think it's interesting that you mention what happens after elections, right? Because what then tends to happen is we vote, whichever party we want, and then we vote them into power. And then, a year later, we all go on social media to complain about how there's no service delivery and you guys promised us all these things, but you haven't come out with it. How important is it then to you, Mbali, that people need to know, like Lindy was saying, what to do after the elections? How do we go about holding our leaders accountable for promises that are unfulfilled?
I think that it's important, and just to Lindiwe's point on digital platforms, we're also going to be launching a digital platform. So for us, we think that civic education is obviously very important. And in fact, we work together with Futurelect in making sure that we can push to young voters that we interact with. But we also interact with young voters at the stage of actually getting them to register to vote and then giving them the civic education. And then importantly, like you say, even after the election, to make sure that on the day they are there to then protect that election. So they're not just passive citizens who kind of just went out and voted and registered. We want them to be involved in even understanding what happens on election day. So we're also going to making sure that we are recruiting people to be able to be election observers, because that's a really important part of our democracy. You also have to protect your democracy on the day. And everyone lives very close to their voting station. So this is another avenue for people to become active citizens. But certainly after an election, instead of just worrying about what the political party is not doing, the reason that civics is important and the reason that the work that we do is important is that you then have almost a passport to know what to do. So if your ward councillor doesn't do what they're meant to do, there are avenues from council to speakers, there are PPP commissions, where an ordinary person can go and present their case and get themselves heard. And by law, they have to be allowed to do that. So even for people to understand when their council meeting sits or when an MPL is going to come and do a report back meeting. All of these things are the kinds of things that we continue to make sure that people understand even after the elections, because that's how you plug into making sure that you know what's happening in your community. And that's the first place. You have to be active in your community before you think that you can really affect change everywhere else. But if we're all doing it, then of course we're going to get the change that we want at a national level.
Absolutely. Mbali, do you have any kind of final thoughts or comments that you would like to make to anyone watching the web series right now?
I think what's important is that people need to realize that democracy is a group project. We only succeed if all of us take part. We have to go out and we have to do our civic parts, whether it's registering or voting, because unlike other countries, we don't have mandatory voting. So if you don't show up, then it's almost as though your voice doesn't matter. And for me, this also means even if you are a person who's registered, who has voted, you probably have nieces, nephews, or people that you know that you can really spread the information to. And we need to make sure that this message gets out, not just for the elections, but afterwards. And it needs to be something that we all take as being part of our civic duty to make sure that we're spreading it.
Absolutely. And for you, Lindiwe?
Yeah, I think one of the biggest national questions we have to answer in South Africa is what kind of citizens do we want to be? What does it mean to be a citizen in this country? Are you somebody who sits back and waits for other people to do the work and then complains when they don't do it in the way that you wanted it to be done? Or are we the kind of citizens who show up when it's time to vote, who show up when it's time to make big decisions, who show up when it's time to fire bad politicians and hire new ones? Do the consistent daily, weekly, monthly work of being a part of the fabric of this democracy. Those are the choices before us. Unfortunately, at the moment, we are very much a passive citizenry. So there's a huge amount of work to be done to shift the culture of democratic participation in this country.
Absolutely. Right, ladies, thank you so much for joining me on the show today. Much appreciated. So just as Lindiwe is saying, listen, you need to decide the kind of citizen that you want to be in this country. And hopefully this web series is going to kind of help you try to participate a little bit more, especially when we look at the 2024 elections. We also did cover on today's episode, starting where you are and building from there. And that's exactly what we're going to be touching on in next week's episode when we talk about social entrepreneurship. So be sure to keep it locked, and I will see you then. Bye.